There we go. So, what do you do if you're in one successful career and another career comes calling for you? And it's sort of intrinsic to what you were doing before, but it's very different. And especially when it comes to involving the Herculean body of work of Carl Jung. Today, we're talking today to Aiden Moore, who's been a successful bassist. He's toured with the Hamilton Show and is also performed with Justin Timberlake and Audra Day. And today we're talking to him about this new calling, which is uncovering and exploring the journey through feelings of failure and loneliness through a Jungian point of view. It's really good to have you here, Aiden.
Hey, thank you, Kim. That's a wonderful intro, and it's a pleasure to be here.
What was that first moment you knew or identified that you weren't living in your highest quality of life?
Mm, it's a good question. I'm not sure if it was a moment. It was sort of a pervading sense that I had at that time that essentially had the feeling that I should be happier than I was, I think. And particularly when I was at the height of my career as a musician, sort of the feedback I was getting was that I should be happy, that from the outside I looked quote unquote successful, or from the outside I looked quote unquote happy or should be happy. And there was just a rub, inside it didn't feel that way. And so there was sort of just a pervading sense of that. Um, but it took me kind of until my late 20s, early 30s to come to the point of saying, okay, I have to do something about this. That was
Mhm.
kind of a bit of a turning point for me.
Mhm. And so those moments that you were realizing that, what were some of the mindsets you had to use or some of the barriers you had to overcome to finally make that leap to get out of that career and start following this path?
Well, you know, from the Jungian framework, it's interesting because in some ways it kind of steps out of the sort of coaching modality that I've become familiar with as a coach now and as an advisor now, in the sense that from the Jungian framework, there's a part of us that sort of is our larger self, that
Hmm.
has sort of a larger a viewpoint and a larger voice than our sort of ego voice, our conscious voice. And so for that reason, it's very interesting. It's not always about willing, and there's limitations to what the ego can feasibly accomplish at any given moment when it's out of touch with that larger, when in Jungian psychology, what we would call the self, the total personality, which includes both consciousness and unconsciousness.
Mm.
So the reason I say that is because part of my problem was that my conscious self was so out of alignment with who I really am. And at the time I didn't have that conception. I just knew that something felt off. But when the mindset changed, it wasn't necessarily a conscious choice. In other words, I'm going to use my ego, I'm going to use my consciousness to fix this problem. The Jungian approach is not that, although that's a very common sort of coaching approach. The Jungian thing is, okay, I have my task here is to pay attention to the voice that's bigger than me, quote unquote. And in my case, that meant going into Jungian analysis. That meant paying attention to dreams and trying to have a life that was more in alignment with the sort of total personality, again, consciousness and unconsciousness. And over
Hmm.
time, that shift happened. That's the
Right.
mindset shift.
No, that makes a lot of sense. When was it young? Like you're out, you're playing music or you're coaching other musicians and you're doing it through, you're doing the coaching world. How did you come across Carl Jung's works? Was it just like was there randomness involved or were you did you is it something you sought?
Yeah, I would lean more into the randomness. It was so funny. I mean, I had come across his name in a couple of, other people's books. Essentially, I'd heard of him, but it wasn't around me. I wasn't around people that talked about it. My family wasn't talking about it, um, and this is where it's tricky again. From a Jungian framework, it's like delineating between chance and meaning. So you could say superficially it was total chance.
Mm.
Statistically, scientifically, it was just sort of random. But from a Jungian framework, it's very meaningful to me um, that I encountered it because it really changed my whole trajectory and became um, a foundational aspect of my thinking. But essentially, I had seen his name in a couple of different books, is the short version. And then I felt at the time when things were not going so well, when I was working on a Broadway show called Spideman Turn Off the Dark, which was very interesting because the music was written by Bono and The Edge, who, were people as an adolescent I grew up really looking up to. They wrote the music, and so my former band worked with them, Bono and The Edge, to work on the music, and it was this whole crazy time in my life. And that was one of those moments where I thought I should be very happy. This is very exciting. Um,
Right. You've reached, you're working with your childhood dream. This is the path. And that's the thing. It's like, what happens if our childhood dreams, and that's something I would love to segue to because I
hmm
have this quote from Carl Jung.
hmm
What did you do as a child that made the hours pass like minutes? Herein lies the key to your earthly pursuits. And
hmm
that really strikes home for me because, I went on a shamanic journey last year and
hmm
was told that I had my original identity taken away at a very young age. And I've been
hmm
spending most of my life getting comfortable and being okay with being in the spotlight and being on this new journey. When I was a child, all I wanted to do was interview people and talk in a microphone all the time.
hmm
But I also like to watch ants, but I can't really figure out how that fits into the whole thing. But it's like, so what do you think about that quote in terms of going back? Like, if you think about you as a child, you were kind of doing what you wanted to do to some degree, right?
I love that quote, and also the way you tied it into your own experience. Because ultimately, a lot of this stuff can get a little bit heady, and I'm doing a lot of research now where it becomes very voluminous and heady. But the thing is, it's really about practicality and it's really about lived life. So I love that you can tie that into your own experience. I think from the Jungian framework, you call that loss of soul. That's sort of the mythopoetic way of putting it, the loss of soul. You lose a part of yourself in childhood, or you don't connect with it, or whatever the case may be, and it gets left behind. And so
Mm.
but life continues, of course. And I'm using that term actually quite intentionally because in some cultures, tribal cultures and such, it's really a thing. Loss of soul is an experience, and they have a name for it. We don't really. I mean, in psychology, we have false self versus true self, and all kinds of different categories of psychiatric problems. But in other cultures, there is this idea of the loss of soul, and so I did have that experience. I remember I kind of awoke to that as a teenager, and interestingly, Jung had the same experience too, and had to go back to his childhood to regain some of that. In fact, for any of your listeners, if they want to have a fun corollary to this idea, there's this film on Netflix called My Octopus Teacher. Have
I
you seen
love
this?
that film.
Uh,
Love that
Isn't that
film.
wonderful?
So beautiful.
He's a great example of that, right? Because he was sort of reached a point where he was kind of depressed, and he was very successful in his career, but he hit a ceiling. Um, And so what did he do? He went back to his childhood loves, being in
Yeah.
the ocean, being with the ocean. And they show the clips of his childhood home that was right by the water, and so that's what he did. He went back to a childhood um, part of himself and reconnected to it, and it changed him.
Right. Right.
So there's something to be said about that.
And came across this other soul that is this unlikely soul, which was this little octopus. Yeah, it was so beautiful.
hmm
So do you feel that people have blocked their, I want to go back to failure and loneliness for a second. Like, do you think that the failure and loneliness is an indicator? I mean, we all have to walk through loneliness, right? Like, it's a natural state of
hmm
being. But do you think that there's levels of that are indicators that they're blocking their highest quality of life by not being in their full soul's capacity? Is that a Jungian perspective, or is that an Aiden Moore perspective, motivated by Young, because eventually you're shaping your own you, right?
Mhm,
You're
mhm.
just you're just inspired by Young, right? Like you're not Young. So what is your point of view?
Funnily about that, Jung at one point said, "Thank God I'm young and not a Jungian." Uh, bec and he was
So
concerned that people
are you a Jungian?
I guess I'm an Aidenian if by that sense, but doesn't sound so cool. But I'm cool with that, I can be an Aidenian. But, that is a good distinction, I'm glad you make that distinction because at the end of the day, whatever ideologies we borrow from and take on as our own, there is in my point of view, there is an important shift, which is when it really does become yours, when it really does become yours, not a borrowed train of thought, not a faithful train of thought. And I realize that can be a little bit challenging, but I mean that in the sense of rather than knowledge, it's some sort of borrowed um, sense of reality.
Mhm.
And that's a very different experience than saying, um, actually, this is what I really think, even if I first heard it from someone else, or even if I first got it from a faith practice, there comes a point where you say, but this is really what I feel, or this is really what I think. And that's sort of a different experience. So from the Jungian thing, I think a lot of it has become actually synonymous. Like Jungian and Adenian have become synonymous in a lot of areas. Um,
And in terms of the loneliness, like from your point of view, loneliness or failure, do you think those are indicators of a lost soul from your point of view, having studied Jung?
yeah, loneliness, I would say, and failure. That's hard. I think loneliness can happen across the board. So from my point of view, and this is my point of view, as differentiated from Jung, um, it's going to happen whether you're on track or not, because even to be one's self is such a unique experience. I have learned as I've gotten more and more connected to my who I really am and what I really think. There is a loneliness about it in the sense of you become a unique being. I mean, I could go into a little bit of a thing here, and I'm trying to avoid it. It's like I think they can be indicators. I think probably more failure than loneliness. I'll say that. So feelings of failure, because then you have a doorway into what your um, definition of success and failure are, and what your framework of success and failure are, and how you're currently
Mhm.
living out of that. And,
Mhm.
and so I think that's a very good indicator.
Yeah, and just to spitball off of that, I was very motivated in my thought with what you just said is that I feel lonely, and I just realized this right now. So this is like in the moment epiphany.
Hmm.
I feel lonely when I'm upgrading my soul
Hmm.
because my soul's never been in this place before. So if I don't use a relationship or alcohol or people please, all the things we could do, and I just am in the upgrade, I'm kind of lonely. I'm like, it's just me, maybe it's me and my God or whatever, but it's just basically me.
Hmm.
And knowing that, I feel so much better because then I'm going to have those hapless days that I'm just like, that's not bothering me. I'm not lonely. Well, I'm not upgrading on that particular day. I'm just me, the new me, or maybe I've fallen back on the old me. And so this is so helpful to people. I know we talk about writing books on this show, and I know you're going to endeavor to put this massive tomb of material, of Jungian material together. And so I was curious, like, how are you going to approach this? Are you going to pick a couple different categories like a loneliness and failure to write your book about, or what's your current thinking on that?
Well, currently I'm in the process of thinking about it, but what I've started doing is going back and retracing my experience of Jungian psychology and how it affected my life kind of chronologically, like the way you just
Mhm.
had an experience and where had this thing, oh, this is really a helpful thing and I can apply this to my life. I sort of have a series of those moments if I go back. So I'm thinking it would be helpful to just chronologically almost write about them. For example, initially his idea on psychological types. That I had a massive epiphany with that, in the realization of, oh, we all have these different ways of looking at things and these different ways of reaching decisions, even though we're in the same world, so to speak, we're experiencing it
Mhm.
quite differently. That was like so there's one, but I have a series of these kinds of epiphanies. So I'm thinking of going back and just kind of starting one at a time because it is such a tomb of work and it's a little overwhelming to think of how to encapsulate the whole thing. So I'm in the middle of trying to figure that out, actually.
Well, I think it's gonna be an important book because you're gonna make what could feel archaic to people. And I know that you aren't necessarily wanting to go into the, although you have mentioned being in academia, it's not going to be like this academic, book of reference points to Jung. I mean, here's what I see. I have bigger visions for people, and I look at someone like a Pema Chodron, or I look at someone like Joe Dispenza, or someone like that. Do you think that you could go out in the world and be like a powerful voice and a leader? I mean, you have performer in you. It's interesting. I watch people that are performers and they get a great idea of what they want to do and they put the performer away and then they cultivate the great idea and then they realize that they can go out and perform the great idea but on a
Hmm.
different type of stage. Is that something that's interesting to you?
Yeah, that's a amazing storyline. I love that. And it is kind of interesting, and I may do it. I don't know the size of what I'm about yet. That's a funny thing to say, but I don't know. It feels like kind of like a boutique. It's like for because one thing I've learned about this like type of psychology is it's the opposite of one size fits all. It's the opposite. It's like it's a one person to person. It's the opposite of the one size t-shirt. It's like I
Mm,
think there's many frameworks that are the one size t-shirt, and there may be a select few for whom that framework works. Like, let's just say existentialism because that's coming to my mind. There may be some existentialists out in the world and they get the existentialist t-shirt and it fits just right. But for some people it's going to be too big and for some people it's going to be too small. And so you say that's not the right t-shirt for them. And the Jungian is very much that way, the Jungian psychology. So it has a select audience. And so it will be interesting to see what the scope of that is. I think in my case, I never want to lose touch with the sort of who's in front of me. Like even in this
right.
conversation, although I'm talking about myself and Jung because I love the subject of Jung very much, my peak moments in this conversation are when you have an insight or you're talking about how it fits into your thought process. That's very alive for me.
Yeah.
So and you really can only do that on smaller scales.
Right.
So it'll be interesting to see what sort of scope my work turns into.
I'm very much looking forward to seeing where it goes. And I would love to, talk all day about these teachings this is an area I particularly love. And I know that my listeners love exploring new mindsets and coming up with new ways to live, but we have to end. So I want people to know that you are on YouTube, right? You've been doing a little bit of YouTubing on these concepts. Is that correct?
Yes, I've been doing presentations that wind up on YouTube through a community called 52 Living Ideas. We can provide a link to that, hopefully,
Sure.
and my website, aidenmoore.com, AIDEN. If you're interested in the Jungian topic specifically, I'm hosting a Facebook group called Jung School. So it's JUNG School on Facebook. You can find us there. And that's basically what I have at this moment.
I love it. That's a lot. No, that's a lot for people to dip a toe. Well, thank you so much for sharing your journey with us. And I look forward to seeing the next levels in which you may go.
Thank you so much, Kim, and to be continued.
TBD.